you have your power users and they want more. And so you want to design more sophisticated, more sort of advanced features for them. And then you have, which is really, if you think of like the law of technology adoption curve, right? Like those users are really like the, I don't know, first 2.5 or 12.5% of the total market, right? The innovators and the early adopters. And then you have everyone else essentially, right? And so, but you've still got to design for them as well. So that's where we're thinking about, educational content, and like whether it's in-app content or YouTube or a support site, trying to educate people in terms of like getting them over that initial learning curve. So it's just watching people use the product, talking with them, but it's interesting based on their sort of background and skill set, how different the feedback is, which is one of the hardest things to kind of manage and digest, because you're like, okay, well, which direction do we go in with this particular feature?
Hi everyone, welcome to Design Drives, where we explore why, how, and what design and designers are driving forward. The mission is to interview the most forward-thinking designers and innovative creators on the planet, to inspire and help you to reach your full creative potential and to make a positive impact in the world. In the episode, I chat with Dan LaCivita, who is the co-founder of Play. Play is a startup based in New York that creates a digital design tool where you can design apps directly on your phone. In the episode, we chat about the role of mobile interactions for innovation, but also why innovation often starts by saying no when it comes to product requirements. The approach of focus actually opens up the field for innovation. We also dig into cross-device interaction and his experience leading a major design agency in New York called Firstborn, which got later acquired, where we learn about how to run a large design business and grow it even further. I hope you enjoy the episode. All right, I'm here with Dan LaCivita. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So we're looking forward to the conversation with you. So you're co-founder and co-CEO of Play in New York, which is a mobile-first design tool, which I recently came across. Super interesting how you guys approach basically a new way to design digital products. So really looking forward to learn more about that. Also, how does it shape the design process for the designers? So yeah, really looking forward. I think it would be really great then for the audience if you can just give a bit more context maybe about yourself, how it all started out for you. You have a lot of experience in the design industry, running a design agency. So I think just digging a little bit into that, a little bit about your journey, how it all started out for you would be great.
Yeah, of course. So prior to Play, so I co-founded Play with three other co-founders, three other partners, June, Eric, and Michael. We all worked together for now well over 15, 16 years at Firstborn, which was a design and technology agency that Michael founded in 1997. So I actually started at Firstborn as a Flash developer back in the good old Flash days, and ultimately was the CEO of Firstborn. June was our chief creative officer. And so we all worked together at Firstborn. My background, it started as a Flash developer, sort of made my way into product management, project management, and then just worked with the rest of the team and built the agency. And I think that was one of the things that I enjoyed doing most, was just working with the rest of our team members and kind of building teams, growing teams, and helping to build the agency. And so we ultimately sold Firstborn to Dentsu. That was actually 10 years ago. And then June and myself stayed for 8 years after we sold. And it was then we decided to leave and then start Play. So at Firstborn, we're always designing websites and mobile applications, for clients. And I think it was always looking at the tools that we were using, and there's amazing tools and there's been amazing advancements in a lot of the design tools, but there wasn't really anything that was focused on mobile product design. And so that's where June kind of got the initial idea of, it's like, I think we just need to change the approach of how we create a platform for mobile product design. And so eventually led him to come up with the idea for Play. And then we started Play about almost 3 years ago. So we've been at this a little over 2.5 years now.
Yeah. And maybe just to give people a bit more context what Play actually is, right? It's a app basically that you can use to design your mobile application, all that kind of digital products, but you do it directly on your phone. I think that's sort of the twist, right? You guys, I think, are expanding towards different platforms right now, but maybe you can give a bit more context also how, I think you're already touching about like, the problem that you guys came across, and basically what you tried to solve. If you can highlight that a little bit, and how, it all started out basically with Play.
Yeah, of course. So Play is the first native iOS design tool that allows product designers to design, prototype, share, collaborate directly from their phone.
Mhm.
And so I think the question is, so like, why the phone? Why use the phone as an
Mhm.
input
Yeah.
device? What problems does this solve? And so to look at that, you have to look at kind of the existing workflow, right? And so think about you're designing a mobile product, right? You're
Mhm.
designing a mobile app. Your workflow probably looks something like this, right? You open up your primary design tool. That's probably Figma or Sketch or Adobe XD. You start laying out your artboards, you're designing your artboards, and then you want to see what your designs look like on your phone. So you download a mirror app, sync up the phone, and then you're sort of looking at your designs on your phone. And in that moment, you want to make a change because nothing is ever perfect the first time, right? So you want to change something in your design. You have to put your phone down and you have to go back to your desktop, make that change, resync, and then look at it again. And this was something that June would always talk about because he would when he would design for mobile product, he was like, I want to get my designs on my phone and then I want to like go and look at them like out of context of the office. Like maybe I'm walking home back to my apartment and I look at them on my phone or I'm on a park bench. He's like, and in that moment, I realize that I want to change something, but I can't. So I
Mhm.
have to like remember what I want to change, go back to the office tomorrow, make the change. And so that was the beginning of the idea where he was like, I want to just change it right in that moment. I want to have my phone and then look at that and then change it right in the moment. Be able to experience my design as I'm designing it on the medium that my end user is going to experience it on. And what was cool is that as we kind of built it out, we realized that being able to plug into iOS, it opened up all of this other opportunity, right? Because right now our design tools are amazing general design tools. So I'll use a design tool, like you'll use Figma to design a website or a mobile app or a wedding invitation or a business
Mhm.
card or a resume, which is amazing. But if I'm a mobile product designer, what if I want to have video in my design or my prototype? What if I want to have a calendar or a date picker? What if I want to have an input text field or a native modal or a map or any of these things? I have to create these hacks to like fake it in my design tool.
Mhm.
And so with Play, we just serve up all of these amazing things that Apple has created and give designers the ability to kind of play in the sandbox that Apple has created. We layer our essentially our Play UI on top of that, and we give them the properties to manipulate. So you want to add a live map, just one tap, you add it to your page, you drop pins wherever you want to. You could connect that to a stack of cards to swipe through, and now it's connected to the pins. You want to use real native pan gestures, right? Instead of using web technologies to try to
Mhm.
simulate, right,
Yeah,
native gestures,
exactly.
panning, swiping. So it's those are some of the things that differentiate the product. And the focus is really how do we create a platform specifically for designers who are designing for the mobile phone? How do we make that the best possible design experience?
Mhm. Yeah, totally makes sense. I mean, is it then basically like a little bit like Webflow where you can experience the product directly, where it's kind of similar to doing a prototype? I think you mentioned like adding a map, for example, right? And using the actual leverages from the system.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good. I would say it's a good analog. The one meaning like so as you're designing in Webflow, you're designing and building the website that you're creating at the same time, right? So you're able
Yeah.
to see the thing, the real thing, right? It's you're not creating a simulation. So Play is similar in that way. However, we don't classify ourselves as like an app builder per se because there isn't
Mhm.
like an export to app store functionality,
Yeah.
right? Maybe in the future, that will be something, certainly something that we talk about, a lot. But right now, our focus is creating the best possible design tool for mobile, for teams, right? Individuals designing for mobile. We're beginning to think through what does developer handoff or code export or sort of app store
Mhm.
submission, if
Mhm.
we go that route, look like. But yeah, you're making a real app when you're designing in play, and the person that experiences it is also experiencing it as a real app. It's not like a like a wrapper around an app, and it's a real native app that you're creating.
Yeah, and I think probably what works great then is also the sharing functionality, right? Because since it's mobile first, it's easier to kind of like share it with people to get feedback. Yeah, super interesting. What are sort of like key issues that you had to solve in the process? I'm sure, like, I think before the episode, we already in interaction a lot with like active users, right, to get feedback. And I'm wondering a little bit, what are sort of like key challenges in the design process of the design tool, and how did you overcome them?
So many iterations
Yeah.
of the product. I mean, it's what the great thing is having co-founders and partners that are just really, really smart and really good at what they do. Between June and Eric Hang, we call him Ang. In the early days, it was just really them, right? Like, I'm not coding, they're just thinking through, what is this? What does this core interface look like? How can we essentially fit an entire design tool on the phone? Which, by the way, I thought was impossible in the beginning. You know, I was like, guys, I don't think. I was like, Gene, really? Like everything on the phone? Like how? Like how? And he's like, yeah, I think it's possible. I think we can do it. And I'm like, well, I trust. If anyone can do it, I believe that you can do it, right? So, I think the cool moment, as you've seen in the product, so we make liberal use of sliders as the core UI to change property values. There's other things as well, but essentially, when you're using the editor in play, you're
Mhm.
using sliders to change the value of something. And so there was this kind of cool moment where June was playing around with that and Aang was coding it. And when you were dragging the slider, everything would disappear and you would just have the knob of the slider. So you can see what you were changing on the page. And then you can also move the slider vertically in case it was in the way of something. So it was like this magical moment early on where, after trying lots of different UI ideas, that was the one. And we sort of knew it, like the guys knew it. And then when I started to play with it, I was like, guys, this is like magical. It's like, and then everything started so then you pressure test it, right? You're like, okay, well, is it going to work to change this type of property and this type of property? And you sort of push it through every possible iteration of what it needs to change. And it kind of worked. So that was like the building block. But it's so many different, we get feedback from users, and we use the tool a lot, but there's nothing better and there's nothing more painful than watching a user use your product for the very first time. Right. It's very illuminating, especially with a tool like ours. This is a very different way to work. So there's certainly a learning curve, right?
Yeah.
But once you get over that learning curve, there is this like sort of magical moment where you're in this flow state and you're like, wow, this is actually pretty incredible. And so, but it's getting to that point where we learn so much from our users and how we've like fine tuned the interface, as we've gone, and then made larger product changes. Like, our users have been asking for an iPad application for a very long time. We're excited that in the coming weeks we're going to be delivering on that. So we'll launch Play for iPad. I'm really excited to see what that response is and how users use it, because it'll have a direct sync to the phone. So it's pretty cool. Like, you can be designing on your iPad, you can hook up your keyboard and your mouse if you want to, and you can have your phone on at the same time and see all the changes in real time back and forth. So you can just go back and forth between the two devices, which is pretty cool. But all that's just from listening to users, talking to users, and figuring out what the pain points are and kind of what they wanted. But yeah, we have a great team that's able to. I think one of the key things has been not being so precious about any solution. Like, we may think it's a great solution, but if users don't get it, we've got to kind of rethink it. And so we have really smart team members, but everyone's very open to feedback and trying to constantly just make things better. And I think striking that balance is always really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, So, and then like, how do you manage that relationship with the design community? I mean, it's basically designing for designers a little bit, right? How do you manage that relationship and you have that testing community and facilitate process with prototypes? Any kind of learnings that you have there for the audience?
Yeah, it's interesting. The feedback is very, um, I would say, contextual based on the designer's experience and background. So what I mean by that, like, so for example, in Play, it's not a free form design tool, right? It's not like you can just drag and drop anything anywhere. You have to think through the structure of the product that you're designing. So similar, like, think of it as like if you had to use auto layout in Figma all of the time, it's a very like the layout system in Play is based on like Flexbox or CSS. So if you're a designer that either uses auto layout in Figma or has experience in, knows what like Flexbox is, you'll pick up the layout system in Play really quickly. But if you have no experience in that, your first question is, I don't understand how to lay things out on the page. So that designer's feedback is going to be very specific to like the layout system because they're just coming from an artboard design tool where they're placing everything in an absolute position, right? Whereas the feedback from a designer, like a product designer, maybe they have a little bit of engineering background, or they just understand how apps are made. They start to go very deep in their questions and their feedback. Like, oh, can I link external data to my collection view? Right. So they already know what UI collection view in iOS is. They know that we can use it in Play, and they're already getting one step ahead and wanting to make the power user features even more powerful. So it's like two ends of the spectrum where, and I think this is it for every product, right? Where you have your power users and they want more. And so you want to design more sophisticated, more sort of advanced features for them. And then you have, which is really, if you think of like the law of technology adoption curve, right? Like those users are really like first 2.5 or 12.5% of the total market, right? The innovators and the early adopters. And then you have everyone else essentially, right? And so, but you've still got to design for them as well. So that's where we're thinking about, educational content and like whether it's in-app content or YouTube or our support site, trying to educate people in terms of like getting them over that initial learning curve. So it's just watching people use the product, talking with them, but it's interesting based on their sort of background and skill set, how different the feedback is, which is one of the hardest things to kind of manage and digest. Cause you're like, okay, well, which direction do we go in with this particular feature? So
that's always a big struggle with any kind of product development. You have that you like the extreme users, the early adopters, like you said, and the more people who for them it's a complete new product. They need more time. So kind of like that tension and kind of making sure like you're not over engineered like towards like one of these directions. I think that's always a challenge, right? Because if you implement more expert features, then the other side it gets lost and it's not simple enough, right? So it's always a big problem. Yeah, and I mean I think the other kind of interesting aspect here is that by saying no on like product requirements, you can actually open up a room for innovation. So what I'm trying to say is that when you look at the other graphical design tools, you can do a lot. I mean, you can design a banner, you can design like a website, you can design the logo, you can do a lot of different things, right? And that flexibility is great. But if you said, okay, we don't need all of that, but we take one specific use case here, we take that use case of that user, for example, NAP, right? And we design a tool towards accomplishing that the best way, you basically ending up with a different product. You have to say no to a lot of other things, but it basically opens up a room for innovation, right? That you cannot get any other way, right? It really just comes from like what do you say no to? And I assume like then if you know your use case better, you can have a very systematic approach. So what I'm seeing also from Play is that it's very much driven also by a design system approach, right? Where you set certain sort of headline colors, etc. So it's really all designed towards that specific use case, and you just end up with a more tailored solution for that use case.
Yeah, exactly. Because we know exactly who we're designing for, and we know like you're not going to use Play to design a website. right? You're not going to use Play to design, a business card, or it's not a free form design tool. So to your point, we just want to make the best possible tool for people designing mobile products, period. Right. And
Yeah.
so that gives us focus, and it allows us to just laser in on what are the pain points of that particular user and inside of this workflow. And of course, there's always nuance in the workflow, but it gives us focus, which is really important, because if not, you can just be all over the place and then you lack direction. So we know the direction that we're going in, and that focus, I think, is really important.
Yeah. Yeah. No, totally makes sense. I mean, there's also a big movement around sort of like no code, sort of no code movement, sort of like in the design industry where, and I think with your product, you kind of get closer to that vision to a certain degree. I think you said in the beginning, it's a little bit more down the road potentially, like that you can export this even to an app, etc. Right? Obviously, a lot of technical things still to solve for that, but I think overall, so it hints towards that future, of course, considering all the technical limitations. But how do you see that sort of playing together, sort of that overall movement towards a designer going further into shipping products, and sort of like what you are building here in terms of like an overall vision?
Yeah. So good. It's a really good question. So I think ultimately it's about the end audience that we're serving, right? And so right now our focuses are on product designers inside of product teams, right? And could be any size team, right? But we want to focus on teams that are designing maybe their first app for their business, or maybe just be iterating on existing features, or on features for an existing app rather, or maybe it's an agency, right, that is doing a lot of different mobile products, mobile apps for clients. So if there's a code export feature, it's probably catered more towards individual SMBs, right? Like where I'm going to export my app that I make and play and then put that in the app store.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably not the enterprise level, right? Because the engineering teams there are like, well, I don't want the exported. Like, you're just going to give me an Xcode file. Like, I don't know what good is that to me, right? We have our whole framework that we're already engineering in. So I think the use case of how we close the loop is really dependent on what user are we trying to serve. So in the example of a larger product team inside of an organization, the question then becomes, well, what is their workflow from design to engineering, and what's going to be most valuable and most useful? How do we get something that a designer's created in Play? How do we get that to an engineering team where it's going to be useful? Because there's so many dev handoff capabilities and tools and code export, and like none of them have really been all that successful, right? Probably for a variety of reasons, but mainly like engineers want to work in the way that they want to work. So our first step was creating a tool that at least created some boundaries for a designer to think through the product that they're making. So an engineer right now, even if an engineer, we get this feedback from engineers, they're like, what's cool is if I look at the design file, like in Play, I can see the structure of the file, and I know that my designer is thinking through the things that I'm going to have to think through when I'm actually building this. So it's almost impossible to give them something in Play that isn't possible to engineer, right? Which is always like like designer makes something and design tool, and then engineer looks at it and be like, well, we really can't do that way, right? And then you have a back and forth all the time. So in Play, it's kind of cool because the more educated the designer gets, the more they begin speaking the engineer's language, right? So they'll be we'll talk to a team and they'll be like, oh yeah, like I'm building this carousel of cards or this list. And we'll say, hey, you should use a collection for this, right? And a collection, what that is it's taking advantage of UI collection view, which is this amazing thing that Apple creates, which every app that we uses. And it's a way to have lots of cells of content, right? So a list app, and the way that it manages loading is really, really performant. So you should use this if you're going to have like a feed, let's say, of content. And so that's awesome, because then when the designer uses that and they say, oh, I'm using a collection for this, their engineer is like, oh, wow. Like they're almost surprised, like, oh, you know what you're talking about. You designed it in the way that I'm going to actually build it. So I think the first thing is like setting that paradigm almost of like language of like how designers are creating the same way that engineers are going to build things. And then thinking about what can we extract from that process that's going to be actually usable in the form of, code and syntax and more of the granular stuff that an engineer may use.
Yeah, totally makes sense. I can totally see also that use case that you described earlier. When you were saying like designing on the go. I'm using myself like a like website provider where I can also change parts of the website on the mobile interface. Sometimes just like changing a button or a hyperlink, etc. So there are definitely these use cases coming up where this is like super handy. And of course, everything else that you said towards the sort of product proposition. You already mentioned that you're also thinking about cross-device interaction with the iPad app, right? So I'm wondering a little bit about that, how you see that sort of like playing out. You have a mobile application, and then you have an iPad application, potentially even the desktop version maybe in the future. But how do you see that interaction to play out? Do you see different use cases there? Any kind of learnings on how do you sort of like considering like a cross-device interaction?
Yeah, I think from the cross-device interaction, it enables flexibility, right?
Yeah.
Ultimately, where I can now design and experience my design and share it on multiple devices, right?
Mhm.
And so, why is that valuable? Well, I may want to use my tablet in certain scenarios. I may want to use my phone in other scenarios. I may want to use my desktop in other scenarios, right? So, I think for us is the understanding of because all of those mediums, all those devices, they have pros and cons, right? To how they're used. Like when you're designing, if you're designing on your phone for like 8 hours a day, like it's not really sustainable. Like the cognitive load and then focusing on the device for that long uninterrupted is very different than looking at your desktop, right? Now, what's interesting is like and of course, I'm experienced using Play, but like I could make something in Play in an hour that would be, I think, nearly impossible to create in another design tool with all the interactions and native capabilities. It's almost, it'd be like a fully functioning app, right? So you can actually create much more in a less period of time, which is kind of interesting.
Mhm.
But for the multiple devices, it's cool because we'll enable also like real-time multiplayer. So when teams are working, you can have one team
Mhm.
member working on the same file from a phone, from an iPad, maybe
That's
other
cool.
platforms,
Mhm.
which is really cool. Like right now, when we're testing with the iPad,
Mhm.
it's really cool because I have the iPad open and I'm editing from the iPad and I have my phone turned on and I'm in the same project on my phone. You just sign in with your same user credentials and I'm seeing on the phone my edits I'm making on the iPad in real time, like which is awesome, you know.
Mhm.
Um, and that's the other cool thing. One of our users the other week, we're on a call with them, and they had a really interesting point. They're like, the play file is like the source of truth now because they were like, I have to admit, it was a little bit of a curve getting them to download the app, but
Mhm.
now that they have the file, so like they were creating something, they shared it with their boss, with their C-level executive, and now that that person has that file on their phone, anytime they make updates, they just need to go and tap on the play file and it loads the latest file. So it's a living sort of connection between
Interesting.
the root file and the actual like the prototype file, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, and you probably can give directly feedback there, and it's just a little bit more accessible, and that makes such a difference, right? Versus like opening a tool or some kind of website to kind of look at things. So, but just bringing this a little bit closer to people, yeah, I think this is very very cool. I mean, it's like a living document, like you said, like a live document, and so basically can see a stakeholder can see the current version of the design process at any time, right? Um,
Exactly.
yeah, you're not just an entrepreneur and manager of that new startup, but as you mentioned in the beginning, you were also running the design agency Firstborn. So I'm wondering a little bit about your learnings, during that period on sort of design leadership overall or growing design agency. So what were some key learnings? I mean, I know that this is a sort of like ongoing topics also for our audience. Like, how do you grow your business, design business potentially, grow sales, etc. What were some of the learnings you had there running and managing that design agency when it comes to growing the business?
Mm. Yeah, from a growing the business standpoint, the So agencies are service businesses, right? And I think, but they're creative businesses. I think you need to realize both of those in order to be successful, right? And so what I mean by that is you're a service business. So at the end of the day, like you have clients that you need to serve. Like that is what they are paying you. They're paying you to be there, but they're also ideally paying for your expertise, right? And that's the beauty of, I think, like the agency world, where like you have a client that doesn't have the capabilities that the agency does, and so they seek out a partner to do something that they can't do, right? They've got a problem and they seek out that partner. So for us over the years, we were all project based. And so that's a challenge, right? Because from a revenue standpoint, because like you have a great year and next year it's like January 1st, you start all over again, and it's very, you've got to replenish those projects every year. So you're constantly, you know, out there trying to get business, or if you're lucky, and we were lucky, where you have a lot of incoming opportunities, right? So word of mouth and being able to just get incoming opportunities. But we eventually, I think like what helped us grow the business was a balance, and it was a challenge, but it was a balance between project business and agency of record business. So the agency of record business provided some, from a financial perspective, stability, because you're able to at least have some baseline of what your cost structure is, but you've got some baseline of revenue that you can sort of account for the year. And then you have the project-based business, which honestly are what I think a lot of people come to an agency to work for, because they want variety. They want to work on different types of projects, different clients. And so that balance, I think, helped us. It helped us, create a little bit of stability and then get a couple of AOR, clients, still peppering in some of the project-based work. I know a lot of agencies don't, they rely solely on incoming because they do great work, and they have so much incoming opportunities. But I think for us, we always wanted to have a new business team. So because there were certain clients and certain projects that we wanted to seek out, right? We wanted to go, it'd be amazing. We work for this brand, and we wanted to go and seek out that brand and see if there was a possible partnership, there. But the other thing was, once we had a project, how do we turn that project into a long-term client? And that's where the service part of the business comes in, right? Because even if you're delivering great work, that work needs to deliver on the business objectives of that client. And that client needs to feel like they're being serviced by their agency. And so I think being able to, you get a project worth, $10, making that number up, obviously, right? You get a project where, the $10, the idea is like, how do you 10X that project into a longer term client over the course of the year? So that would be kind of one of the goals that we would have as well, from a growth perspective. Take a project, turn it into a long-term client.
That makes sense. I mean, yeah, it's basically an act of balance, like you said, right? So you have like new business development, and then basically your ongoing relationships which you're trying to scale. And I mean, if you're not focusing on the business KPIs, then you can't really build like a long-term relationship, because then like your partner's not going to succeed, right? So
Exactly.
I think that also makes sense. You also mentioned that you saw this agency, right? So I mean, if you selling a service-based business, right? Then I think the aspect of systemizing a business is, I think, very important, right? So like, how do you like make your operations efficient and sort of like systematic, so you can create reoccurring basically outcomes, and using a lot of documentations. Was that sort of like a key enabler going towards like a step where you could actually sell an agency business? Any kind of learnings towards like managing operations and making that more efficiency, and how does it play together with sort of like acquisition of agencies?
Yeah, good question. To be honest, we were pretty gritty.
Mm.
And even after we sold, to an extent we were. So what I mean by that is like, it was, and Michael would say this, like the financials were, it was, an Excel sheet and QuickBooks, like nothing fancy. Just, it's a pretty straightforward P&L, right? Like when running an agency, right? There's not a lot of complexity to it, quite honestly, like from a financial perspective, right?
Yeah.
We never had a CFO. Like Michael was the CFO and then I was the CFO. And someone could say, well, maybe you could, but for us, the key was there's the most important thing in the agency are the people creating the work, because that is what clients are paying you for, right? Anyone else, they need to be important as well. What the question is, how do they enable the agency to do what the agency does best? So that's everything from HR, finance, right? Administrative roles, et cetera. I think it's so for us, it was like, how do we keep those as lean as possible? Because every dollar that you don't spend on creative engineering, project management, et cetera, like that's what clients are paying you for. Clients aren't paying you for how great your, finance team is or anything like that. Right.
Yeah.
So I think it was, just keeping a close eye on that, and honestly, just trying to invest back into the team, our team, whenever we could. We were by no means perfect, but we had really long average tenures of people. People stayed with us for 10, 11, 12 years. And that's a long time in the agency business, So I think that was, that's a key thing, right? Because if you have turnover, if you have a high degree of turnover, there's a high cost for that as well, right? Because you've got to onboard new people. It causes internal like friction, morale. It's sort of like ironic, right? Because companies, and I never really experienced this, especially early on with our holding company, but I've heard other stories of other holding companies where you get so much pressure to cut costs to, maintain a certain profitability, and they don't realize like there's a higher cost to having all of your great people leave because you need people to do the work. So now you need to go and hire people for more money, most likely overpay them, and they're not going to be as talented. Like that doesn't make that much sense. You're much better to, I think, overinvest in the people that you have, as long as they're really talented and you think that there's a high degree of certainty that they're going to stay at least for a decent amount of time, so they can continue to deliver value, for the agency. So it was kind of like back to basics in some way, like try to treat people as well as you can, find good clients, deliver great work that helps meet their business objectives, and have fun while doing it. That's sort of like, that was our recipe, I guess.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. As you're running the agency business, I think one of the aspects that probably played a role there was also to maybe advocate for design, or advocate for the value design can. I think you already mentioned like business KPIs, etc. Was this sort of like an ongoing sort of like topic for you in terms of what you guys can provide in terms of business value, if you would be embedded in a project, and how sort of like how did you sort of frame the value design can bring towards businesses in these conversations?
Yeah, good question. I think one of the most important meetings that you would have would be like the first meeting with a client, where you could ascertain the value that they put on the design. Like you could write, like, so if whether it's a pitch or whether it's an initial meeting, you have a few people from your agency, you have a few people from the client, you do research on them, you figure out what their background is. You can probably assess whether or not they value design to this in the same degree, to the same degree that the agency does. And if they do, that's usually great. It also means that they're probably highly opinionated, which sometimes is not so great, depending on the egos of the creatives inside of the agency, right? Or I guess how good the opinions of the clients are, right? They can be highly opinionated with not great opinions, which is sort of like the worst case scenario, right? But so I think like usually in that first meeting, we would have a saying where it's like, usually things don't get better than that first meeting. Like if it's not a great meeting, don't expect them to like miraculously, like if you're trying to sell the client on the value of design, I don't know, they may just not be a great fit, because then it's not like you have one meeting with them and you're like, hey, so let me explain to you the value of great design. What does great design mean? Well, it's more than just pretty pictures, right? It's a way to think about your business, and it's a way to think about how your customers and your consumers interact with your brand and your business, right? And it's like, you're going to constantly need to reinforce the value of design throughout the whole entire project. So I think like the best clients for us were clients that we would always say, like, we need two things from you. We need feedback and we need faith. right? Like we want your feedback because you know your brand, you know your business better than we do. Although we're going to work really hard to understand your business. So we need your feedback, but we also need your faith. Like if you should be hiring us because you believe in what we're doing, and you believe that we're great at what we do. Not perfect, but great. And so we need your faith that, you know, we're going to be able to deliver on what you ask of us. And so I think like those clients were usually like in the sweet spot where they would push back sometimes and give really good feedback. But then they would, you know, you'd have a moment where the team felt really strong about something and we'd have to step in and be like, hey, listen, we really think this is the right way to go. We kind of need you to trust us on this. And, you know, that's just built over relationship and having trust, right, between, you know, the client and the agency.
Yeah, absolutely. Dan, I think we covered a lot of different topics all the way from design tools to, you know, how to run an agency and advocate for the value of design. So super interesting. I think we need to wrap it up because of time, but it was really nice hearing from you. So just would like to thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, that was the episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to give it a thumbs up and let me know in the comments about your thoughts and biggest learnings from the episode. I'm always super curious about that. You can also tag me in a post about your biggest takeaway and share your insights with others to pass on your learnings. If the episode provided you a lot of value, make sure to follow, subscribe, and share it with friends and colleagues so they also have the chance to learn and grow. Until next time, cheers.